As you've heard, the theme of today's talk is why lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender issues matter to you. And it really is very simple, because many of you will at some point in your life have same-sex experiences or know people who have. And so for that reason, you need to understand the issues so that you can feel comfortable in your own skin, regardless of whether it's you who are gay or bisexual or your friends or family. So perhaps we could start with thinking about numbers. On average, most research suggests that about 10% of people will have a same-sex experience and possibly even a same-sex relationship at some period in their lives. Now, it may not be permanent. It may be in their teenage years or even in later life. So I've got friends who are now married with a wife and children who in their teenage years and early 20s were in same-sex relationships. I also have friends who are now in their 70s and 80s who have finally come to the conclusion that although they married and had kids, in fact, they were really all along gay. So, for example, there's a friend of mine, for many years, I think from the age of 20 to 45, he was in a long-term same-sex relationship. Eventually, that relationship broke down. Several years later, much to this man's surprise, he met a woman at an event. They really got on with each other. And the next thing he knew, they were in love. And they're now having a heterosexual relationship. And he looks back on the past and thinks, well, my same-sex relationship was fine. While it lasted, it was fantastic. But now, I'm having a heterosexual relationship, it's also fine. So I think the point is that sexuality is a bit fluid for some of us. Not for all of us, but for some of us, it's a bit fluid. And our sexual orientation can change, or maybe, more accurately, a hidden aspect of our sexuality may come to the fore. And we may experience both heterosexual and homosexual relationships. It's very interesting that the Observer newspaper has been conducting a regular sex survey every few years. And the most recent one questioned young people aged 16 to 24 and found that 23% had had a same-sex relationship. 23%, almost a quarter of all young people aged 16 to 24 had had a same-sex relationship. Now, it may have just been a one-off experience, or it may have been ongoing, but the point is, nearly a quarter had some same-sex experience. A year or so ago, there was another poll which asked the same demographic, young people aged 16 to 24, would you say that you are 100% heterosexual? 49% said no. Just fractionally under half of young people aged 16 to 24, when surveyed, said they would not regard themselves as 100% straight. So it indicates that as homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia declines, more and more people are feeling comfortable about acknowledging their same-sex desires, their attractions, and also, in some cases, expressing them. So, to go back to the original question, that's why it matters to you, because you may be one of these people. Right now, you may think of yourself as 100% straight, but who knows what you'll feel in 20 or 30 years' time. Maybe you'll be like the friend of mine who had a straight relationship, was married and had kids for many, many years, and then in midlife suddenly fell in love with a man. Maybe you'll be the reverse. Maybe right now or in the near future, you'll have a same-sex relationship. But later on, 3 or 4 decades later on, maybe you'll fall in love with a woman. The point is to be open to possibilities, to not repress your inner self, to not feel you have to conform because what your family or your religion or your community or society says. Be true to yourself. Be what you feel you are, and be open to the possibility that you may not be what you think you are. So that brings to the question, well, what causes homosexuality? You know, why are people gay? That's a question that's often asked. No one ever asked the question, what makes people straight? I wonder why. I wonder why the question is always, what makes people gay? It's like, gay is a problem. Well, in fact, we know now from a huge body of research that the primary determinants of sexuality, both gay and straight, are 2 basic fundamental factors. The first is our genes, our genetic inheritance. That's one of the major factors. And the evidence for this is that when it comes to identical twins that have an identical genetic makeup, if one twin is gay, then in 50% of cases, the other twin will also be gay. That indicates a strong genetic factor. In non-identical twins, if one brother is gay, then 50% will be gay also. The other brother will also be gay in 50% of cases in the case of identical twins. But in the case of non-identical twins, then when one twin is gay, the other will be gay only 22% of the time. And that compares to unrelated brothers. If one brother is gay, then probably only 5 to 10% of the other brothers will also be gay. So the indications are very strongly that genetic factors do play a role, a significant role. They're not the sole determinant, but it seems that in about 50% of cases, they are the determinant, or at least about 50% of the factors that produce sexual orientation. The other significant factor is hormonal influences in the womb. When children, are in the womb, when a fetus is in the womb, there are hormonal influences from the mother. And it does seem to appear that in a very significant number of cases, there are differences, hormonal linked differences, between gay men and straight men and between lesbian women and straight women. So if we look at height and weight differences, which are related to hormonal influences in the womb, we can see that on average, gay men weigh slightly less and are a bit shorter than straight men. Equally, lesbian women are on average weigh more and are taller than heterosexual women. So there's a differentiation there, a differentiation that's known to be related to hormonal influences in the womb. When it comes to the onset of puberty, gay men tend to reach puberty at an earlier age than straight men and have their first sexual experience at an earlier age. But interestingly, there appears to be no differentiation between heterosexual women and lesbian women when it comes to the onset of puberty and first sexual experience. But with lesbians, there's an interesting differentiation in auditory mechanisms in the ear. There's a difference between straight women and lesbian women in the ability to hear very low sounds. So for lesbians, they have weaker and less numerous perceptions of very faint sounds compared to heterosexual women. When it comes to finger ratios, if you're right-handed, it's on the right hand. If you're left-handed, it's on the left hand. So I'm right-handed. The finger ratio between the index or finger and the ring finger is on average difference between gay and straight men and between lesbian and heterosexual women. So in the case of gay men, the index or pointing finger will tend to be longer than the ring finger, which is very similar to straight women. And conversely, compared to straight women, lesbians' ring finger will tend to be longer than their index finger, their pointing finger. So that's very similar to straight men. And all these factors are related to hormonal influences in the womb. And the final example I'll give you is when it comes to penis size. I'm sorry, straight guys, but on the whole, gay men have larger penises. And again, that is very much influenced by hormonal influences in the womb. So the conclusion is that there are very significant factors in terms of hormonal influences that appear to be related to sexual orientation. There are differences between gay and straight men and between gay and straight women. But these are only averages. I'm gay, but I have a ratio between my pointing finger and my ring finger, which is typical of a straight man. So this isn't a fixed, inviolable ratio. But on average, that's the way it works. Then I guess there's the argument, well, people often sometimes say, not so much now, but in the past, that homosexuality is unnatural. But of course, if you're LGBT, there's nothing unnatural about it. It's perfectly natural to be LGBT if that is the way you are. And if you look at other animal species, there have been about 400 to 500 major studies of non-human animal species. They're collated together in a book called Biological Exuberance, written by Bruce Bagamill and published by Profile Books in 1999. He looked at 450 of these major studies, these in-depth studies of other animal species. And he found that homosexuality and bisexuality existed in every single one of them. From birds to reptiles, mammals, insects, and fish. Whatever the species was, he found evidence in the published data by reputable scientific studies that homosexuality and bisexuality exist in all these diverse animal species. So he concluded that not only is homosexuality natural and intrinsic to humans, but indeed to all animal species. So it is natural. Another argument is, of course, homosexuality is abnormal. Well, what is normal? You could say it's not normal or natural to wear glasses or to drive a car. These are things we've created and made. It's not natural to be able to overcome lots of illnesses, but through scientific and medical insights, we now are able to cure lots of previously deadly diseases. So nature and normality are very much cultural and subjective things. Now the point is, homosexuality is obviously natural and normal because it's existed in all societies throughout history. Not just in every animal species that's been studied, but also in every human society that's been studied. And it's existed even when it's been persecuted. There's been a very famous study by Ford and Beach, two anthropologists, which was published in the 1960s in a book called Patterns of Sexual Behavior. They looked at the research on, I think it was about 76 tribal societies in different parts of the world, from the Middle East to Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. And they looked at all those studies and found that in 2/3 of those pre-capitalist tribal societies, untainted by Western culture, in 2/3 of those societies, homosexuality not only existed, but it was either tolerated or accepted. And in some instances, those societies actually venerated same-sex people. So in some North American native tribes, we find that people who have a same-sex attraction, men who are perhaps effeminate, are regarded as what they call two-spirit, a mixture of male and female. And that is seen as a very important and prized quality. And often those people in Native American tribes are given special roles as shamans, as medicine men, as guardians of the tribe's culture. We see that in parts of Africa, before the advent of colonialism, quite a large number of African societies had and accepted and had particular indigenous names for people who had same-sex attraction, or for men who were feminine, or women who are masculine. There is in some West African societies a tradition of when husbands go away on long hunting trips, that the two wives would get together, and sometimes this would involve a sexual relationship. It was a part of the culture, but a culture that's been suppressed since the advent of colonialism and since the advent of Christian missionaries to those societies. I mentioned that homosexuality has existed even when there's been attempts to persecute it and eradicate it. Many of you will know that as well as targeting Jewish people, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, and many others, the Nazis targeted gay and bisexual men for extermination. Indeed, in some of the concentration camps, there were experiments done on gay and bisexual men to try and cure and eradicate homosexuality. And although the extermination policy was not as extreme as against Jewish people, on the whole, gay people were given some of the hardest and toughest tasks in the concentration camps. So many of them were literally worked to death, and some were singled out for execution. But even though the Nazis had this policy, they failed to eliminate homosexuality. That was their plan, to eliminate what Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Gestapo, said was, quote, abnormal existence. They did not succeed. In Iran today, there is, and Saudi Arabia, there is the death penalty for same-sex acts. But despite that, same-sex acts happen, and LGBT people exist in those societies. The state propaganda in Iran against LGBT people, the arrests, persecution, and sometimes execution of LGBT people is very extreme. But it hasn't been eradicated. And in fact, a few years ago, the Iranian parliament set up a commission of inquiry to investigate young people in Iranian society. What do they do? What do they believe? And one of the questions was about same-sex relations. The Iranian parliament expected to find, as their president had once said, there are no gays in Iran. But instead they found that of high school and university students, 17% had had a same-sex experience. 17%, nearly 1/5, despite the fact that homosexuality is punishable by death in Iran. So you can see that attempts to eradicate homosexuality simply do not work because it is intrinsic to the human condition. Many of you are familiar with the writings of Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis. He argued, based on his clinical experience, that everyone has a bisexual potential, that homosexuality and heterosexuality are not fixed and immutable, that everyone has this potential within them. And in the late 19th century and early 20th century, at a time when homosexuality was deeply frowned upon, he advocated that LGBT people should be treated with dignity and respect. And he wrote a very famous letter to the mother of a gay son who'd written to him pleading about, you know, the terrible thing that her son was gay. And he wrote back and said, you know, do not fret and worry. You know, to be gay is just a part of being human. There are always going to be some people who will have that attraction. The big major study on homosexuality was, of course, the work of Dr. Alfred Kinsey in the United States, published in the late 40s, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, I think in 1948, and then later, Sexual Behavior in the Human Female in 1953. Now, he interviewed thousands upon thousands of men for his male study and women for his female study. And in his male study, he found that 37% of all the men he interviewed had had a same-sex experience leading to orgasm. So not just, you know, playing around, but actually a full sexual experience leading to ejaculation. 37%. He found that 25% had ongoing same-sex experiences for a considerable period of their lives, and that 10% would have a same-sex relationship for 3 or 4 or more years of their lives. So those are quite substantial figures. When it came to women, the figures were all slightly lower. In fact, not more than half compared to men. And obviously that was put down to the fact that women's sexuality in those days was very much repressed. Women were very much seen as appendages of men. The whole sexist, misogynistic culture made it very difficult for women to recognize and accept same-sex desires. And of course, without financial independence, because in those days most women didn't have financial independence, it was very difficult for them to lead independent lesbian lives. There was a study by Masters and Johnson, the famous American sexologists, in the 1970s. And they again came to the conclusion, like the others, that homosexuality was just part of the fabric of human sexuality. They concurred with the Kinsey view that human sexuality was a spectrum. That at one end there are people who are 100% straight, at the other end there are people who are 100% gay. But in the middle there's lots of people who are a mixture of gay and straight. And in fact, of course, people may not express their same-sex desires. They may feel them, but they may never act upon them. But nevertheless, a very significant portion of the population do have a mixture of opposite sex and same-sex attractions. I don't want to sort of bore you, but I remember once, about 20 years ago, although I see myself as pretty much 100% gay, I had an erotic wet dream with a woman. It surprised me, but obviously I thought to myself, hey, that obviously means there is some fragment in my unconscious which indicates that there is some opposite sex attraction somewhere buried there. I felt comfortable with it, I felt relaxed, I haven't done anything about it, but I would never say no, no, no. I would never say never. Who knows what might happen in 10 years' time. The final, perhaps, thing I want to share with you is the question about why are people homophobic? Now, Sigmund Freud suggested or implied in his writings about psychoanalysis and the unconscious that many people often project onto others their fears and anxieties about themselves, or displace onto others feelings they cannot acknowledge about themselves. So Professor Henry Adams in the United States at the University of Georgia in the early 1990s decided to test out this theory. And he published his results in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology in 1996, which is a publication linked to the American Psychological Association, a very authoritative journal. And his research was as follows. Like Kinsey, he took a representative sample of men. His study was only involved male homosexuality and homophobia affecting men. So he took a representative sample of men, and he gave them a questionnaire to ask them about their sexual orientation. So it had questions like, have you ever had a same-sex experience? Have you ever had a same-sex attraction but not acted upon it? How would you define your sexuality? And then he collated all the answers, and anybody who said they'd had a same-sex desire or an erotic wet dream involving a man, all those were discarded. So he was left with a group of men who defined themselves as 100% heterosexual, never had the remotest or slightest same-sex desire, attraction, or experience. And then he gave them a second questionnaire, which asked them their attitudes towards LGBT people. How would you feel if your son or daughter was gay? Do you think gay people are entitled to equal rights? What would your reaction be if your boss was gay? And then he collated all the answers, and some of them were quite extreme. Some people said if they had a son or daughter who was gay, they would kill them. Others said they would disown them or kick them out of the house. Some people said, no, gay people shouldn't have equal rights. They should be locked up and thrown away. The key should be thrown away. But others said, if I had a gay son or daughter, I'd love them. That's fine. Yes, of course, there should be equal rights for LGBT people. So he divided the responses into two very extreme groups. One group who said they were 100% straight, but were relaxed and comfortable and supported equal rights for gay people. And the other group that said they were 100% straight, but hated gay people and supported discrimination against them. And then one by one, he invited each of those men to come to a video suite at the University of Georgia, where he wired them up to a plethysmograph. I'm sure you all have one at home. A plethysmograph is a small elasticated device which goes around the penis and is wired to a computer. So if a man gets an erection, obviously the elasticated device expands, it grows and gets bigger and bigger. And that is measured on the computer. So it's a very accurate account or calculation of sexual arousal. If people aren't aroused, it won't get bigger, it'll stay small. If people are aroused, it'll get bigger. So first of all, he showed each man heterosexual porn videos of men and women having sex. And then he showed them gay porn videos. And then, after he'd interviewed all the men and got their reactions, he then collated the results. He found that of the men who said they were 100% straight, but were fine with gay people, when it came to watching the straight porn videos, they got very strong arousal. When it came to watching the gay porn videos, a small number also got a degree of arousal, but not so strong. Then when it came to the group that said they were 100% straight but hated gay people, when they watched the straight porn videos, on average, their arousal and erections were much weaker. Well, some were only slightly weaker, but on average, they were weaker. But when watching the gay porn videos, these very homophobic, hateful men, 80% got erections watching the gay porn videos. So he concluded that extreme homophobia is often a displaced form of homosexuality. That people are projecting their homophobia onto others because they can't recognize or accept it in themselves. And when he interviewed some of those people afterwards, he found that many of them were in total denial. Even though the machine recorded that they got an erection, They completely denied it. They said, it's impossible. I hate gays. I can't stand gays. But the machine does not lie. So they couldn't even accept or acknowledge their own feelings. They were so repressed and so hateful towards gay people. But then some did admit that they used homophobia as a way of convincing themselves. Some of them said things like, my reasoning is, if I hate gay people, I can't be gay. Or, if I hate gay people, no one will suspect that I am gay. So the upshot is that Professor Henry Adams, his research has tended to bear out the theory of Sigmund Freud, that homophobia is often a displaced form of homosexuality. Something, a feeling, a desire that people cannot accept, and they project that non-acceptance and so on onto other people in anti-gay hate. So I think I'll finish there, and perhaps we'll open up now to questions and contributions from you. So thank you very much.